one here.
Yeah, congratulations. That's such a huge honor. I'm so proud of you. And I'll be throwing that into my introduction of you today.
Woo, woo.
I don't know what it is, but congratulations, Preeth.
Thanks, Sammy. So is this currently live streaming?
I believe so. Because there's like, and if people are tuning in, I'll never know, but there's like a 20-second delay or something like that when you go on the live stream. So we may be fully in live stream mode already, which is fine. Oh, no, we're not. I don't think so. We're still waiting. So I'll wait for another minute and then I'll go into my little spiel. How does that sound to everybody?
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay, I think I'm ready to go. And hopefully all of this is recording and live streamed. And if it's not, then we'll just record the Zoom and send that along to people to watch. So hello, Sasrika Fateh. Welcome to the third and final roundtable as a part of the 3 curatorial talks being held concurrently with the chashm-e-bulbul exhibition. My name is Raji Aujla, and I join you all from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples as well. Sikhs extend their solidarities to the original caretakers of these lands in ethos, pathos, and mythos. Today's conversation is to think about what an imagined future for Sikhs can look like by using an intersectional feminist lens that considers Sarbat Tapala as a fundamental guiding energy. I'm humbled to be joined by panelists Pamela, Kirit, Preeth, who are currently exhibiting at the exhibition, as well as grassroots community organizer Sammi, who's based in Kelowna. Pamela Matharu is an immigrant settler of North Indian Punjabi Sikh descent, born in Birmingham, England, based in Toronto. As an artist, she explores a range of transdisciplinary feminist issues, blurring the lines between objects, activism, community organizing, and public pedagogies. Practices include object making, curating and organizing, including one of the best exhibitions I saw in 2019, artist-led teaching, arts administration, advocacy, and social practice. Kirit Kaur, while a newer friend in my life, is a Canadian-born artist and architect that has been beautifully contributing to my lifestyle through her work on Instagram over the course of COVID. I feel when I am looking at her work, it takes me to another time and place. Her work takes shape through the disciplines of painting, sculpture, hand embroidery, music, and architecture. She gathers inspiration from Indic philosophies to evoke themes of spirituality and fantasia. Her aesthetic lies in the realm of surreal, merging mundane and dreamlike qualities. Preeth Anand is an artist, curator, cultural worker, creating and working on the unceded territories of the Kwantlen. Oh, I suppose you're not there now, you're in Ann Arbor. So I'm not going to say where you are now, and I'll let you do that. She holds a BFA honors in visual arts, along with a second major in psychology from the University of British Columbia. Her art practice interrogates the so-called neutral audience in multicultural society. To accomplish this, she uses materials, particularly textiles, language, performative gestures, and photographs that resonate beyond the typical art gallery context. I'm proud of this young artist who was selected as one of the 3 Canadian Emerging Artist Award winners as declared by Ontario's, Pamela, help me out.
The Natition Foundation.
Thank you. This is a huge honor and a proud moment for all of us. Congratulations. Sami Barar will be joining us from my hometown, Kelowna, BC. She has extensive experience working with volunteers and community groups nationally and internationally. She has a strong background in using data analysis to direct strategy. She's known for starting novel and cutting-edge programming within the parameters of the institution's objectives. Sami also curated an incredible public art mural in Alberta, and that was such an inspiration to see from abroad. How are you all feeling today? Give me thumbs up. I threw that in there because I needed a break to take a sip.
Yeah.
So we've all been chatting through in different spaces, chatting about different things. We've all known each other, either directly or indirectly. And one of the reasons why I wanted us to be chatting about Sikh futurity specifically is because you bring in such disparate vantage points that will help us really look at this from an intersectional as well as inclusive lens. An inspiration for me is Nikki Guninder Kaur Singh's critical analysis of Sikh literature from a feminist perspective that discloses the centrality of women and convincingly shows that Sikh gurus and poets did not want the feminine principle to serve merely as a figure of speech or literary device. It was intended rather to pervade the whole life of the Sikhs. And similarly, in Black feminist theory, they consider feminist future is only achievable if it includes everyone, which of course contradicts the role of those female identifying in current systemic structures today. Understanding how race, caste, class, sexuality, gender shape our communities is the foundation of an imagined future that I'd like us to chat about. Pamela, beginning with you, your visual essay at chashm-e-bulbul, stuck between an archive and an aesthetic, really spoke to so many different experiences and forgotten voices in Ontario and Canada. I wondered, you approach your contemporary art from positions of critical pedagogy and using intersectional feminist lens. Can you please tell us about this approach and more about that piece specifically?
Sure. It's an experimental video essay, and I made it in conjunction with a large show at A Space Gallery. The curator there, Vicky Mufowad Paul, invited me to do my first solo project in Toronto. And I've been working in Toronto. At the time, it was 25 years in the arts, in the visual arts sector, and by now it's like 27. So one of the things that first stumped me was someone who's often called, I'm talking about myself here, someone who's often called that everybody knows me and, oh, Pamela, like, you're everywhere. And I didn't quite understand why people asserted to that kind of way of thinking when they thought of my work, my practice. And I had to really start to really do a deep dive into like, what is my practice? Why do people often say that I'm everywhere or whatever? But just to give you some context, the entire show was a response to a number of things. First off, the video responds to I found 2 videotapes that were thrown away from the AGO Library and Archives, and they were titled Identity in a Foreign Place, and they were dated October 1st and 2nd of 1993. And that's in a very important time period when you think of the cultural sector, because it's really at the birth or like the burgeoning sector called the culture, or the discipline of cultural studies. And before that, there was not really any language to it or keywords, like, and it was really about like looking through the lens of multiculturalism. So I think multiculturalism was dying out, and then cultural studies was coming up. And what I did was I watched the tapes over and over again. And it was a literary symposium that happened at the AGO, and the Goethe Institute in Toronto also helped arrange this. And I found a writer named Lakshmi Gill, who is of Sikh and Punjabi Sikh and Filipino descent. And she arrived here in, I believe, the late 70s, 80s to go to grad school. And, she starts to tell her story around writing because it's a literary symposium. And the reason why that program happened and why I found these videotapes, I guess, was it was documentation. Perhaps it wasn't very well done documentation, but I found them in a refuse place called Arts Junction, and Junction spelled Junction. And I couldn't believe that I found them. And in fact, it's probably been like 15 years since I found those tapes, and they were dated 1993. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. So I'm just shy of 20 at that time, but when I found them, it was like just 15 years ago. I finally, when I got this solo show, I finally decided to go through all this archive material that I had. Preeth, you've heard this story probably almost 10 times, I think, in the course of 2 years, but Lakshmi Gill starts to tell her life story around her identity as a writer, and she is actually alive and well. She's in BC. She got up to a PhD, but then she drops out of the grad studies program, and I was like, wow. And I kept rewinding the tapes and watching them. I went to V-Tape at 401 Richmond to get like an old Hi8 machine. I was like, there's something there. I showed friends, I showed my artistic collaborator, Marilyn Fernandez, I showed a couple of friends, and they're like, yeah, there's something in her storytelling here. So I used that first 7 minutes of her talk in my video, stuck between an archive and aesthetic, because I wanted to place these. No one was going to believe that I found these tapes in the garbage. So I thought, right, okay, why are we discarded from the archive? Right? Why are we in the garbage? Why is it that our contributions as cultural producers, why are they not important to be housed in the archive, the capital A archive? Because of course, this is the AGO's material that was thrown out. Now, when I went to the library and archives to start digging about this, like, what's the deal? Why were these in the garbage? I didn't quite tell them right away, but I found out that this program, this literary symposium, was an auxiliary program of a show called Perspectives, which used to happen in the 90s. It was funded by a benefactor. And it was, I guess, like, people took turns in the curatorial department at the AGO to curate it. And the bigger show was of two artists, Canadian artists, Lanny Maestro and Mike Alexier. And the theme was supposed to be about identity and difference. But I was like, Mike Alexier, who is a very well-known figure in Toronto, has many public sculptures, has worked with designers and architects, makes conceptual, it's well sought out after conceptual art, many collections, and an artist file that's very thick at the artist files registry at the AGO. But Lanny Maestro could comparatively be a household name, but unfortunately not a lot of people know about her practice. She's also a senior Canadian artist, but she doesn't live in Canada anymore. And what I found out was that after some preliminary research is that there was a show that both Lanny and Micah were in. There were 4 or 5 reviews that had come out on the show. And Lenny is of Filipino descent as well. So I was like, right, okay, so then you have a Filipino artist and you have this white Canadian artist who talks about, gender, sexual orientation. So this is a show about identity and difference. But okay, let's do a literary program or a symposium. Oh, let's look for someone of Filipino descent to come and talk about it. Now, this is a very common strategy when it comes to diversity programming. So I guess I started with the question, Raji, to answer your question, why is it that diversity programming is so fraught? And then why is it that people like us, people like Kirith and people like Preeth and Sami and you, why is it that we're thought about with these programs, but then for some reason it becomes very skewed, very misinterpreted, like, you come off coin like, oh, that was such an unsavory feeling doing this project, right? I say this because this is a common conversation I have with a lot of non-white BIPOC artist producers who get approached by major institutions, and one gets excited about an opportunity. That's what we all went to school for. But then it comes out a little bit messy, So what happens when you share a platform and things go wrong or things go awry? I also want to tell you that I knew that the Toronto curatorial community would not believe what I found. So in some ways, in my heart, I felt like, okay, I'll be second judged. I won't be taken seriously. So I created this 40-minute video to give a snapshot of the 90s of the day. After Lakshmi tells her piece and like how she struggled as a writer and stuff, the story just kept resonating with me. Why is it that generation after generation, she's telling this story in 1992. Why is it that I'm in 2021 and I'm also talking about struggle? And then I had also connected Amrita Shergill, if you remember in the show. And the idea there was that this is another female figure from a different time period who also struggled with the Paris salons, who was not really accepted in Paris at all until she started to produce work that looked more or less European. So there's this proximity to whiteness that we always struggle with. I know you have a question probably about that later on, but I'm going to just bring it up now that, if you are drawn to the institution or if the institution is drawn to you, it is often the case that you must mimic. There's this kind of mimicry around making your work with those standards. And what I mean by standards is what the critic, the art writer or the architecture critic or whoever decides to apply some sort of critique to your work. But unfortunately, you get very misunderstood if you work from your center, what you're grounded in culturally and spiritually and philosophically. And we are just misunderstood, right? Because at the end of the day, the proliferation of non-white artists is huge. And, if my generation didn't see so much of that change, or we just had to like suck it up, buttercup, and put up with it. But I hope my dream and my vision is that, and I see Kirat doing it, I see Simranpreet doing it, I see Jagdeep Rana doing it, is that, and many other artists, right? Connor Vanderberg, like we all talk to each other now. So what's changed is that there's more of a community. And there's a kinship in that community engagement, right? And it's really, really important that we talk about these things. And I think from, not that my work speaks bang on around Sikhi, but it definitely speaks about community activism. And I do feel that Sikhi is born of activism. Mm-hmm. And in some ways we are inherently activists in our practices that way. But I don't struggle to be known as a Sikh artist or a feminist artist or a queer artist or anything like that. I'm an artist. I mean, whether my work speaks to you as a Sikh, that's amazing, because I also want to speak to work, that can translate desire for other cultural folks too.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of times it's this self-identifying is not for us as much as it is for the institution. Absolutely. And it's not that I wouldn't introduce any of the artists in the show as Punjabi Sikh or Kashmiri Sikh Canadian artists, like it would just be contemporary artists. So, exactly. But then I heard even when we were doing the walkthrough with the mayor that they were like, oh, wow, like, they seek artists and all this, it's this exoticizing of people that certainly was not led from the center. Mm-hmm. I did want to follow up with a question to Simranpreet with Bande Jashan Din Fanai. Like that entire experience was so, it was conceptually meaningful. It's a stunning exhibition like of your works. But I remember speaking to Pamela, like just putting that together and how much we worked together with institution. And that was an experience that speaks to, of course, what Pamela just outlined in terms of installation and just generally respect of non-Western art. I think we can speak to that for like a long time. So I'm going to stop myself and not ask you to comment on it because I don't want to take it there. Instead, I wanted to say it was a privilege to have curated that because so much, it pulled so many thoughts about my own practice moving forward and this kind of transience of the physical body and our body of work, whatever that might be. So I'm curious to ask you this, how did this work come to you and where did you first learn about the environmental impact and intersection with contemporary Sikh practice?
I mean, there's a really simple answer to that question, which is that I used to work at the place where I found like where they have the Angita Sahib and they do the Agan Bej Seva, which is the cremation of all the Sikh textiles, but also of the Guru Granth Sahib beers that are not legible or not usable for any reason. And a lot of my work recently, I mean, I'm definitely more of a conceptual artist, but I think materials inherently have a lot of meaning. I have been working with the stars, which is the Sikh turban, but also with fulkari and kind of like the history of fulkari in relation to partition, which is work that is still kind of being made and being done and in process. And the Rumallah Sahib is just another kind of material that has so much embedded meaning. And I think just, you know, like seeing these textiles and seeing the way in which they're composed and ideally as like this project becomes, you know, like later in its kind of many iterations, I'll be able to kind of research particularly like where these textiles are created and the processes in which they're created, because I think it's not just the kind of like end of the life cycle of these textiles, which creates toxins in our environments and like, you know, chemicals that leach into the earth, but also this mass production of materials that are unnatural in various ways is also, I mean, I'm like 90% sure something that creates more chemical and more toxic waste. And so there's something, I mean, I think as this body of work progresses, to be said about kind of, you know, where these textile histories come from, what were the materials that these, you know, really meaningful spiritual materials were made of at a certain point, where did those motifs and designs stem from? And then like, I don't know if it's super easy to track kind of the way in which it's morphed into today's, you know, Rumallah Sahib that you'll see at the average Gurdwara, but like a lot of it is due to the kind of colonial and global histories of Punjab and India and how textiles really changed after the world wars and after mechanization and globalization.
How was the feedback when people have you heard from different community members or, Sikh or non-Sikh about this work, and were they able to understand the points that you and the observations that you're trying to raise through this work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the most kind of controversial part of the work is that critiquing spiritual practice is difficult because people hold it so close to themselves. I feel like, you know, unlike other members of the Sikh arts community, Connor and I are really open to criticism and open to conversation. And I think that's really important. I think having community and having that level of care amongst one another is really important. There was a lot of community consultation that went into this work kind of being presented in the way that it has been presented. That includes, you know, conversations with close friends who might have different politics or different understandings of Sikhi, but also people who we sought out that might not have the same opinions as us, and that actually caused us to change certain aspects of the work. And I think, Raji, you kind of saw that shift in some of the work in the way that we had initially described it, and then in the way that it was in the exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was interesting in like walking people through in private tours was the first people that got to see the exhibition was the BG and Me program with the Ladaliya organization. So when these BGs would come in, everybody's hands bowed just inherently in prayer. And when I was so happy that I didn't have to explain what the works were supposed to represent. One of the BGs who had Billiyan Khan, she started crying, and I just remember looking at her and I was like, okay, where is this going to go? Is it going to be, oh my God, these Ramal, they're touching the ground and they're burnt and charred? Or was it going to be that she understood what this young artist was trying to speak to in the future? And she did that, the latter, and said, when we were young, we would pick, the cotton was made from our farm, and the girls would embroider it, and then we would gift it to the Gurdwara or whatever it might have been. It could have even been the Fulkari, but specifically when they were speaking of like the Sikh religious textiles, and now how factories replaced them is what she said in Punjabi. And I said, oh, to replace you. But she said at the end, she put her hand on my head and just said, please keep doing this and telling the future that we did this. It was almost as if she was yearning for her like the legacy of this craftsmanship to continue.
No, it's really interesting that you say that, because actually, so this work is going to be exhibited after chashm-e-bulbul at the Reach Gallery in Abbotsford in January. And I don't think all the details are out yet, but I can tell you about a new work that I'm hoping will be a part of that exhibition, is where Connor, my collaborator, and I have been weaving cotton and weaving a Ramallah Sahib that we're going to give as beta to the Guru Granth Sahib at my parents' house. And it'll be embroidered and then photographed in the setting in which it's meant to be. So it's really this like labor of love and care. And so really related to what you were saying about this BG and like these practices that have evolved and shifted so much so that you can't even really recognize them, and they've taken a completely different shape or form. And there is some sort of course, like idea of yearning, but I think it's also about like coming back to that idea of like, what is the Sikh ethic, and would our gurus have wanted this kind of waste or this kind of, ritualistic practice? And that's a really hard question to ask in the community, because certain people don't really like it when you ask questions, especially when you're like a young woman and if you look a certain way and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's a really fine balance. I think it's a lot harder if you're a woman and doing work that's critical of the institution, whether that's like a contemporary arts institution or a religious institution.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And this kind of segues into a question I had for Preeth. One about kind of Sikh futurity, because your work, Simran, it really points to the dichotomous relationship between Sikh practice or Sikhi like thought and what is contemporary practice, and how that really is detrimental to future generations. And with Gurdwara, what's so interesting is that you're an artist, but you're also an architect, and we speak about systemic institutional barriers, and I think that is not limited to religious or arts spaces, and then also, of course, the environment. So public space design comes to mind when we think about futurity, and it's more important now than before, I think ever before, because when COVID and these events happen, Black Lives Matter, public spaces where we go to resist, where we go to seek solidarities or affect change. And I guess as an artist and architect, do you consider these feminine principles in the works you're making? And if so, like how and with what hope?
I think that what I've definitely experienced up until now has been, I would say, quite a whitewashing of architecture, and it's been quite a focused, narrow lens that I've been surrounded by, at least. And the work that I do and am interested in has always been a bit outside of that frame and that box. It kind of alludes to what Pamela was saying earlier about how, as artists and creators and professionals, we're expected to fit a certain mold so that we can be exhibited, so that we can be recognized, and so that we can actually be understood by the mainstream lens. But what I find interesting is that the lens that is seen as mainstream isn't exactly mainstream. I would just call it the more dominant lens. And I say that because if we're speaking about Sikh principles and feminist principles, all of the communities that are identified through that aren't actually outnumbered. They're just not given a certain power. They're not given a certain voice. And what I've experienced is exactly that. And that's a lack of understanding because of that work being outside of the typical frame or point of view. So what I've kind of struggled with is actually, even after you've created those works that might be true to your own ethos and your own philosophies, despite creating those, they can be misinterpreted. They can be seen from the lens that they want to be seen from. So actually, an example that I experienced during my master's was during my thesis presentation, which was actually completely focused on the evolution of Punjabi architecture and specifically different forms. So quite literally the actual shapes and forms that you see within Punjabi architecture and evolving them, evolving their conceptual principles and giving them a place in the contemporary world. And I just remember that one of the critics, despite me giving the whole background of what these forms mean and what this architecture means to my community and what its future means to my community, the critic just saw it as me taking interest in form just for the sake of form, whereas it wasn't just about the actual formal qualities, but it was the concepts and the meaning that are attached to them. And that's just been like a general sort of struggle that I've had, I think, in all of my work, whether it's architectural or through the arts. It is what it is. Like, it's still, I think that I do still take inspiration from those traditional philosophies and that cultural background, but making it easily understood has always been a struggle. But I do think that since so many of the principles within Sikhi are for the universal good, that we can take a lot of different principles from Sikh thought and create spaces and generate architectural spaces that actually benefit different communities, different marginalized communities, and actually help those different communities, whether it's the elders. That's always been like a really big focus for me. We have an aging population, and traditionally we've always taken care of the elders, but we haven't really done enough, I don't think, to create spaces for them where they can, safely experience one another and, do what they need to do. But what I envision for the future, and it's actually something that I've been conceptualizing in my head for a long time, but I haven't actually put pen to paper, is the idea of a Gurdwara not just being a place of spiritual worship, but of being emerging of that, and community centers. So safe spaces for elders, for children, for women, spaces for learning, and that architecture actually taking metaphorical concepts and turning them into actual spaces. So we have the idea of langar in Sikh culture as a whole, but I think that we can take that a step further by using land that often comes with a lot of Gurdwara and actually farming our own vegetables, farming our own crop, because there are a lot of Gurdwara like present day that have that capability, but they're not actually using it for it. They're either leasing out that land, or it's just kind of used for recreation, which is fine as well. But I do think that if we're going to do these practices and have these spaces, that we can take them to that next step and kind of build on those principles and like the actual metaphors that we speak of, and just giving them a physical dimension.
Yeah, no, absolutely. With regards to your thesis presentation, I recently was thinking a lot about like how much Western knowledge is upheld solely through Western practices of language, reasoning, and thought. And so when you're trying to present a different way of thinking about something, or a different, just in a different idea altogether, how difficult it is, because you have to wear so many different hats. Educator, because you have to educate what's inherently, the problems that you're trying to solve through, say, a design or an idea or literature. But then you also have to translate these Eastern thoughts into a Western language, and it doesn't always connect. But there's a lovely story, and I'm going to share it with you. There's actually a Gurdwara in Chandigarh, it's outside of the Burrell slum where I used to work. And the school is called Sikhya. And I'll never forget the first time I went in to meet the headmistress. It's beautifully, architecturally speaking, it's circular in design. And at the top floor, there was this open area where all the kirtan happened, not just Sikh, but there was like a Hindu mandir. There was like so many different areas, but all of it was through song, this sharing with one another. But because of the architecture, I could hear the acoustics were so beautiful, and it was all these children singing Jo Mange, and I just couldn't stop crying, because I was like, this is the most beautiful thing. And what's great about that school is not only do they look at Sikh as a practice of langar, of seva, and how equitable they are in even the children that they accept. They're all from the Burrell slum, and they'll have 2 children per family, but they'll consider a 3rd child if it's a girl. And so even there, you're like, what? That never happens in Punjab. And so it's a beautiful idea of what Sikhi can look like if applied through these like traditional spiritual lenses. And I think spirituality is a big part of that. And it has like a really big role to play in how we look at textile, how we look at garment, how we look at our being in relation with one another. And Sami, I always say Sami because like my mom calls you Sami too now, but Sami, in our conversations about Sikh futurity, this transcendent spirit is a through line, as I just mentioned. And you have years of experience in community organizing. And I wonder if you've ever thought about like how to create this kind of an inclusive spirit in how we use public spaces, how we come together as a Sangat.
Yeah, definitely. And I think everybody's touched on it in conversation today. I think a lot of it, especially if you look at it from like a Sikh principles perspective of, being revolutionary, activism being at our core, creating space for everyone, universal principles, is that when we think about our community and the future of our community, is that it's kind of like a cycle. Like our history's always been, you know, you're fighting, you have a cause that you're fighting against because you want to create some sort of equality. And then once that's over, then you start on another one. And it's this constant that there's never like the state of euphoria. We're always going to be fighting for what's right. And what we're fighting for is going to constantly change. So when we think about how we operate as a community now, what are the challenges we face? Those are what we're trying to address for the future generation. But the future generation is going to have their own challenges to address. But what we need to do is build this level of resiliency and understanding and creating safe spaces where we can challenge whatever we're facing now in a way that is safe, right? And it's not always been in our community. And I think for us, it's really important that we think about how do we make a safe space safe? Like, what does that actually mean? A physical environment, like, can that be safe, or is it how we interact with that environment, how we treat one another in that environment, how we make others feel? So I think when it comes from like a community perspective, simple things of how we gather, how we speak with one another, and how we engage in a way that allows people to be their authentic selves, allows them to emotionally feel safe to be their authentic selves, is something that I think we need to do more of. Like, and especially when we're talking about Gurdwara, because there's been so many creative ideas, is that, you know, when we think about the history of Gurdwara, our Gurdwara were community organizing spaces. You know, they were a space of politics, they were a space of discussion, they were a space of dialogue. And over the years, and, you know, in the Western context especially, we've kind of adopted the culture of religion in the country we reside in. So now the Gurdwara went from being this revolutionary community space to a place that we only attend on Sundays. And it's a place that we go and attend, and we, you know, attend for a purpose, and then that's kind of stops. And I don't want to say this for all Gurdwara, because some Gurdwara are doing incredible community work, and I'm really grateful for them. And I think that's where we have to keep moving forward, is what are the needs in our community, and how can we offer social services through our Gurdwara? How can we address community needs in our Gurdwara? To Kirat's point, like, you know, food sustainability, if we have the land, how can we create something that's actually beneficial for the needs of our community? And I think that's like that transformative way of thinking about the future, is that everything that we find inspiration in our history from, we are the creators of our future history. So everything that we do now, I think Pamela said it earlier, like, you know, there's generations before her as artists that had to do so much, and now she's fighting for the next generation of artists to face less barriers for her, and they'll continue to do the same. So whatever we're doing now, it's what are we changing for the next generation to make it that much easier? And how will that then continue in our community? And that's the legacy that we're going to leave behind. And I think that's just got to be on our forefront of whatever we do, whether it's organizing or creating art or just interacting in our community spaces. I think being mindful of those practices will really kind of determine where we create this inclusiveness. And like you said, that not having these like boxes to define how things will need to be, but pushing past that and actually just reconnecting with what really matters.
I feel all of that in my core, but I have to say my experience in physical space. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate, because there's no men on this panel, so I get to, but they don't always create spaces that are safe for women. And you know, with the work that the core movement's doing out of the UK, and I think, you know, we have to have honest conversations about where we can improve as well. And I don't think currently the way the Gurdwaras are designed have made me feel I could be my whole self. And I'm going to give just a critical feedback of this. You know, I remember as a child going in, learning Gurbani and doing Kirtan as a family was an act of love. It was always an act of understanding, and it was always an act of sympathizing with people that may not have the same lived experiences as you. And through the Janam Sakhiyan, that's what you're constantly seeing. There's, you know, all these different narratives and insights into the homes of others that perhaps we wouldn't have access to. And through those learnings, we can inspire our way of being now, and hopefully the future generation is the same. Mm-hmm. And I felt like when I would go into the Gurdwara, and due to colonialism and of course the legacy of that, and going in on Sundays and institutionalizing our religion, all of that aside, I remember always seeing these like massive paintings of Sikh torture, and, you know, the depiction of Islam being very dark and almost scary, and then the depiction of gurus being very, of course, just beautiful and, you know, giving. And that kind of, I didn't understand I didn't fully understand that effect on my body until much later, because I started reading more and more. You read about the genocides, you read about the, Aurangzeb, or the different Mughal impact on our religion and religious loved ones. And I started to actually have like an adverse reaction to my Muslim friends being like, I'm not going to Abd Muhammad's house, like I'm done. And then my mom had to take me aside and be like, actually, more Muslims helped us than persecuted us, and we just don't share those stories. And I was like, well, then why? And the second thing to that was, I live in downtown, and going to Weston or PAPE has been so far a positive experience, but it hasn't been for some other women. And so I guess when we think about patriarchy and the practice of that and the influence of that on our religion, we have to, it's almost as if we have to think about it radically of how we can change systems, not gradually, but today, yesterday, that our children can go into a Gurdwara by themselves and be like, oh, it's okay that I'm a woman, I'm attending the Gurdwara by myself. And I'm going to just ask this one question, which is, with the farmers' protests happening in India, and I know, Sami, you've been such a champion of this, that was one area where I was like, you know what? There were safe spaces of resistance for women at the Tikri border. How did that happen? And how come we haven't manifested similar spaces of practice or resistance in our spaces of worship here in Canada? I don't know what it's like in other countries, so I'll just speak to Canada.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to chime in, please feel free. Oh, sorry, Preeth, go ahead.
No, sorry. I'll say what I had to say after you're done. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, like, and again, and it's different in every community, right? Like, I've been to Gurdwara across this country. I've, worked in different communities, and even recently moving to the Okanagan, the Gurdwara here and the community here is very different than what I grew up with in Calgary. And I think one of the things, like you said, with the radical change is that one of the things when we think about safe spaces is that sometimes when a space isn't safe, it's really exhausting to try to be the one that's trying to create change. And sometimes for our own, self-care, we have to step back. And I think with what you're talking about, Raji, what's happened a lot is like when, people tried to create change and it didn't happen. And then, what the adverse effects of that were, and then some of the really negative things that have taken place, people then started separating, right? And we've kind of got this disconnect now of like the Gurdwara exists and the committees run it, but then all of these individuals who would be integral in creating these like amazing spaces don't associate with the Gurdwara anymore because of everything you've said. They've had negative experiences, or they don't feel like it's a space where they can show up as their authentic selves. Not speaking for all Gurdwara, some Gurdwara, like I said, have done a really good job with that. But I think that's where I always think about this as well, is like, how do we reclaim the Gurdwara, right? Like, how do we reclaim that space? Because I think about from a community organizing perspective is, when we needed a space to get together as kids, that was a free space. Like when we were young organizers, we didn't have money to rent a room or anything. So we would meet at the Gurdwara because it was a space that we could actually physically organize in and get together. But that meant that a lot of us that were doing the organizing had to take on the brunt of dealing with the politics and dealing with the, oh my God, why are you guys doing this? Or dealing with the negative comments. But I think about that time in my life, and like I said, like I got to a point of feeling exhausted and stepping away, and I'm slowly trying to come back and figure out what this looks like for me now as an adult. But I think at that time, there was this huge shift in how we organized, and it was just being able to have that space, and that made a big difference. But I think about it from the Gurdwara now, like when we have these conversations, and it enrages me when, we're talking about like sexual assault in the Gurdwara, and there's this culture of silence, and it's like, it shouldn't be like that. And there's so many people, like you said, that are being vocal, and there's so many people that are taking their Gurdwara committees to task. And there's so many people that are saying that, no, like, we're not going to brush this under the rug. We're going to do that. And I think those revolutionary acts of being like, this is our space, this belongs to our community. It doesn't belong to a committee of men. It may have been like that for years, but we as a collective are going to make this Gurdwara ours again. And that starts by smashing that patriarchy. That starts by taking away those ideologies that have been so implemented, that are so against everything that Sikhi stands for. But I am also very aware of how exhausting that is. And though I applaud people who take that on, I'm aware that it's like, I want it to happen right away, But I think that being in the world of activism is a very exhausting place. And in order for people to actually be able to sustain that, there has to be that self-care and that stepping back. And that's why we have ebbs and flows and everything in our community, is because you can't just always be going hard. Probably not the best way to explain it, but I think you get what I mean, is that like there's got to be this intention of creating change and doing it on the level that your community can sustain. And that's going to look different in every community across this country and in every Gurdwara.
Actually, sorry, I think that's a really good point, actually, because I do think that there's a lot of people that have been trying to make that change, but where they actually end up is outside of the Gurdwara, because no one who's in charge of the Gurdwara wants to listen or wants to make those changes. So it's almost as if, you know, those people definitely exist, and these attempts have been made to make reform, but those people either get sick of it, and you can't really blame them because you do have to put your own health first in a lot of cases, and you can't continue the fight if, you know, you're being pushed down consistently. But actually, kind of speaking to what you mentioned, Raji, about images in Gurdwara, I think that that's something that's very common, at least in Ontario and BC as well, just in terms of the way that Gurdwara are adorned. Usually you walk into the Langar Hall and you do see paintings of, you know, different episodes of martyrdom from Sikh history. A lot of those depict men. And I think that obviously that's important because those things did happen and they have important lessons, but I think that visibility is a really big thing to bring change. And I think a lot of it's very subconscious and passive in a way. And what I mean by that is, like, if there's more images of women from Sikh history, if there are more women taking on different roles of seva, and you do see that a lot, like you do see a lot of Buzurg Bijiyan doing Akhand Path Diyan Raulan, and you know, in Langar, of course, and cleaning. So you do see a lot of that, but I think normalizing that more would really make a difference and would really make people more comfortable with the idea of women being in leadership roles. Also, issues facing women, just people being a lot more comfortable speaking about those. And it goes down to even just having like sanitary products in bathrooms, you know what I mean? So it's just like normalizing a lot of things that are considered taboo, but normalizing them in Gurdwara so that subconsciously everyone regardless of gender, is able to become comfortable with those ideas. And if there's an issue facing those communities, they're able to talk about it. They don't have to keep it hush hush. They're not compelled to keep it hush hush, because I feel like one of the main reasons that anytime, you know, there's any of these like assault cases that happened in Gurdwara, people want to keep it hush hush because they're just so not used to talking about issues involving sexual assault in general. But I think that if these things are normalized in more, let's say, passive ways, I mean, when I say passive, I mean more so just subconscious, so that it kind of, it's there, it's very present already, and people see it, they can respect those people's needs. If there are issues like this, then they're actually able to speak about it and actually address it. And one thing that I find really interesting is that, not to say that things were better in the past, but if you do look at Harmandir Sahib, you know, a couple of centuries ago, the Parikrama actually had like different mini dharamsalas of different scholars from different faiths. Like there was Muslim scholars teaching, there was Hindu scholars teaching. So there was a lot of inclusivity in that sense. And, you know, just speaking to the whole aspect of villainizing Islam and Sikhi, I mean, the Mughals did what they did. I mean, that's a fact of history, but then you also do have to remember that there's Bhagat Kabir Ji's Barni in Guru Granth Sahib, there's Bhagat Farid's Barni in Guru Granth Sahib. So I think, you know, it's important to display these images of what Mughal emperors did to Sikh gurus and to Sikh leaders, but it is also important to, you know, when you're showing such an extreme, it's also important to show the other side of it, so that certain opinions aren't formulated just based on, you know, one aspect of how things went. So I think it's just interesting that like in the past, there have been examples of more inclusivity. And like, I understand that colonialism has caused a lot of divide in different communities. And, you know, because of that, I feel like Sikh autonomy has kind of lost a lot of important aspects of the religion and of the culture. But I do think that there are definitely examples of how that was done in the past. And I think those things can be implemented again. And it can be done in a very, I guess you could call it a more, yeah, I mean, I don't want to use the word passive again, but again, it's just like the little steps that
In an empathetic
create more
way.
visibility. Exactly, yes.
And that's why it was so interesting that, you know, the protest sites were so considered for gender inclusivity, children, age, and all of that. And while still in Canada, you know, we're still struggling with just having gender segregation, you know, at such a fluid space of worship. Pamela, I wonder, you know, when we of course, we've worked in institutions for so long, and, you know, these kind of visual images that we have in Langar halls mainly, without the context or, you know, an accompanying text, they're just images that are up for the spectator's interpretation. Like, what could an imagined Gurdwara look like if we were to look at that as a space of learning rather than a space of, you know, historical evidence of, you know, occurrences?
I mean, I have a lot of non-conformist sheroes that I look up to. People like Amrita Shergill, Amrita Pritham, you know, Arpana Kaur, the artist. Like, Sikhi to me is like anywhere you want it to be, whether it's in your backyard garden or your local park or wherever you can find sangat, like, or make a community come together. And I say this because we're talking about making these spaces safe, and I don't feel safe as someone who doesn't prescribe to a binary gender, right? And, you know, and then I'm just constantly barraged about marriage, you know, and things like that. And that's, you know, like, that's my privacy. I mean, in a world that's so public now for millennials and younger, you know, there are aspects of what you want to consider private, and even those kind of communal congregational experiences where you're not, like, you know, because it's this communal idea that everyone's your uncle and auntie and your son and your daughter. It's that kin, right? That fictive kinship that happens. But the cultural resistance that I'm talking about is that my vision, or I'm a practical dreamer. I want these Gurdwara spaces to be safe for, like, agender, or, like, you know, non-conformist genders and sexual orientations, but we are not even there. We can't even talk about dating, let alone like same-sex relationships or trans.
Imagine talking about like a gay Anand cottage in a Gurdwara. Everyone would just like
flip out, right? Or like I'm always, as an educator, I teach a lot of kids who are transitioning. I'm always like, I wonder if there's like trans kids in Brampton or in Malton or in Mississauga. Like, how do they survive? How do they breathe day to day, right? Like, these are some of the thoughts I have around, like, you know, where do these kids get support and access if they don't even get to be seen, to be basically feel authentic in their own selves, in their own vessels, right? Your body's a vessel. So your body is a Gurdwara too, right?
And how does
That's
education?
my thought around it, because it's like, yes, I agree, Kira, that, sorry, I just want to say that, like, there's no open discussion around safety, around gender-based violence even. What about the ongoing epidemic of toxic masculinity in our communities, right? We don't have these kind of conversations. Interesting, this is a forum about art and art making, but, like, you know, these are some of the social concerns that I am troubled with when I talk to community members. and I sometimes just want to say, hey, do you want to look at some art? Like, oh no, you're more interested in buying a $3,000 flat screen TV. Okay. But like, just like buying a ticket to a museum is like, oh, that's so dangerous. Like, but
Yeah, actually, can I say something? There's
please.
been more.
Sorry, I'm being a little bit like, I understand my humor is a little bit dry here, but I have to say
Don't
it.
apologize at all. I think everything you're saying is so poignant. But with even chashm-e-bulbul, the fact that it's a Sikh feminine, kind of a Sikh female leaning, female
Yes,
friendly
it
exhibition,
is. Call it what it is.
we
It's
put
yeah.
so much outreach into. I paid for a publicist out of pocket because the city of Toronto was like obviously mainstream media. And
Right.
we did the whole rounds, and I really do hate talking publicly, but even so, I would go to Brampton and go to like Weekly Voice and all of these places. And then every week I'll have my meeting with the producers and say, so like, tell me about the audience. And there's no Punjabi Sikh or Sikh people coming. And I was like, what do I do? Like when you ask for spaces for our representation and complain about them, then everybody complains about it. But then when somebody does it, there's nobody coming through except for people who are in that area, and mainly like Gore, which, I think that exhibition was for everyone. But when it comes to, it's not a diss or anything. It's just, it comes
No,
to,
I'm not. That's what I'm
it
saying.
comes to education. Like
Yes.
what we're trying to do is create platforms, and those platforms have to be inclusive, pluralist. It has to be considered and safe. And even conversations like this, of what it could look like in a Gurdwara, we want to have these happen, and everybody's implicated by this. And yet when it comes to its effect, I feel like there's like a lack of action or a lack of like, what's next? And I don't know why that is. And similarly, it's like, why couldn't a Gurdwara be an art center at the same time? So, when I was asking you, like, there are these, we have art, it's intrinsically involved in our storytelling, but we have no context to that art. So we can see a scalp being pulled off, hair being cut. We can see these images that are so scary to young people without the context or education or openness to have loving conversations about what we're learning. I feel that's where the community is really suffering personally.
Yeah, and I look to like, I'm not going to sit here and be adjacent to particular communities, particularly on Indigenous land. And like, if I don't know how we all measure success, but if we talk about success, like to me, it's like the fact that someone like, I'm going to use the Carters as an example, what they did with their last collaborative album by going into, like when we saw them go into the Louvre, right? It's very, very skillful, the way they are putting themselves as Black cultural producers in that realm, right? But what do our musical representation, I laugh because it's just like, if I just happen to be like at home on a Saturday, my mom is glued to those shows on the Saturdays on Vision TV, and God bless her. But like, she'll tell me so-and-so's on, or what, like, if a singer I like or something, turn on channel 60, okay. But sometimes when I randomly like look at, some of the representation, like in the videos that come on, and I'm just like, I turn the volume off and I just watch the images. I'm like, man, if I was like 8 right now, I'd be freaked out about Punjab or like going to India, because, out comes the Sardar out of the Jeep and with a banduk on the side, and he whoosh, does this with his shawl. And then, and I'm like, man, I must have, like, I'm close to 50. I must have been watching these kind of videos all my life. Like nothing's changing. What's progressing about our cultural forms, right? Definitely, I can see the visual arts are like, we see a lot of positive imagery. Like, I'm looking at Kirat's work and I'm learning more about Punjabi now than I did when I was a child in Punjabi school. I'm looking at Simranpreet's work and I'm looking at different perspectives around looking at like, ontological objects or all these kind of things that, her and Connor are bringing these ideas forward and actually cracking open a way to actually think through these cultural realms that we exist in, right? I haven't been thinking about these things for a long time because I would just say, okay, you know what? My friends have been sexually assaulted in Gurdwaras. I don't want to walk into them.
Well,
So
and
my strategy was to shut it down, was
Yeah.
to just refuse it, right? Which is a feminist strategy too. Sorry, go ahead, Simranpreet.
No, which is kind of what I want to say. I mean, I feel like there's been so much talk about Gurdwaras and changing Gurdwaras and reform, but like even when we talk about these arts institutions, a lot of, you know, writers and theorists talk about how reforming institutions just doesn't work because they're built in these ways, which they're meant to, you know, perform a certain way. Even think about how Gurdwaras function in Canada, like the ways in which they have to register as a religious center. It's very Eurocentric, right? It's very like, how are you a religious space? You can't like have a Gurdwara be a space other than a Gurdwara just based on the nation state. And like, even thinking about Gurbani, I mean, I feel like I hear the word Sangat a lot more in Sikh, you know, in Sikh theology than I hear the word Gurdwara. And I think that's a really important thing to think about is like,
Yeah,
our gurus, if you think about the Sakya, it's not like they were sitting in these like institutionalized Gurdwara and, you know, making Sikhi happen and writing Gurbani. They were in communities and they were doing community work. They were like planting gardens, they were creating langars, they were writing music. Like for me, Sikhi is not about a Gurdwara. It's not about this like architectural space as much as it's about the Sangat that you hold and like the way in which you create that Sangat around yourself. I mean, I think definitely for people who are queer and people who don't fit into this like very Punjabi Sikh like way of identifying themselves or like living their lives or performing, it's not a safe space. I mean, even for people who call out rape and abuse, like there was a playwright, Preeth who wrote this play called Basically, and like received death threats because what she talked about abuse, she wrote about abuse in Gurdwaras. It's like these spaces weren't really made for us. I don't know why we're chasing after them. I feel like, you know, I was lucky that I grew up in a household where we had a Guru Granth Sahib and where I was encouraged to do, you know, Prakash Seva and Sukhasin Seva and to read Gurbani and to understand it myself. And for me, that's very empowering in the sense that like I can walk into a Gurdwara and if someone tells me I'm not allowed to do Chor Seva or I'm not allowed to read for the Saj Path or whatever, I can be like, look, like I know what I'm doing. You can just go do your own thing. And if they don't let me, then I know that that space isn't for me and I don't really need to be there. Like that's not my guru that they're holding and protecting in this way where like women aren't allowed to read or non-Amritdharis are not allowed to read. That's like some really friggin' backwards shit.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I think the reason why a physical space has been important to me after all these years, because for a while, like I moved to Toronto from Vernon and there was Sangat there in a true form, like it was a small community. And, you know, whenever there was any event that was affecting a family, like everybody came together and tried to be with one another in help, in support and love. And then when I moved to Toronto, zero Indian friends. I was always located in downtown. I was in a very strange university program and there was a lot of like Japanese kids and stuff like that. I just never had the privilege of having Sikh women, especially in my life. And it's something I sought desperately because I started to lose my sense of self working for white institutions. And when I was falling in my mental health, I didn't realize what was impacting me so much. And it was the fact that I couldn't find Sangat anywhere that spoke like me, looked like me, understood the pressure of reputation, the pressure of what success is or failure is, of being single of a certain age is. Like I really had nobody to speak to about that. And I found that to be very isolating. And when I would go to a Gurdwara, I felt like nostalgic to, you know, a bygone era, but it wasn't performing in the ways that I understood it to, in the way I understand it to be performing. So having that physical space would have been so wonderful earlier on in my depression, because I felt like I could have found, I wouldn't have lost myself so much, you know,
I think so,
that
but I
was
think
really hard.
it's important to, you know, recognize that you're creating spaces like this one, or like the previous conversations, where there are all of these like Sikh people, particularly, you know, Sikh feminists, who can think of Sikhi outside of that sort of architecture. And like, I
Absolutely.
don't know,
And I
like,
should say, now I'm making the spaces that I want
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
children to be able to have access to, and their children, and so on and so forth. But it took a long journey, and I'm so thankful that I didn't lose myself fully while going through the ropes, the throes of working in white institution, colonial, as a settler on these lands. Like, I could have not jumped back, and I'm thankful I did. And I jump back now in my full power. And that is to bring women together, and for us to understand Sikhi together, because then to me that reflects how I've always understood this polyvocal pluralist religion to be. One thing I wanted to ask you, Simranpreet, to Pamela's point, is that your work, especially your work with Connor, that I've become quite familiar with, you know, it points to a lot of our practice, and it points to a lot of like our shared experiences and things like that. What do you feel as an artist, or do you feel any kind of responsibility or fear or any kind of pressure when you're producing works the kinds that you do?
I mean, I think there's a responsibility, but also I feel like I should mention this kind of contingency where it's like, if you're an artist making work, it's your expression or your idea or your thought or your question that you're putting forward to people. I don't want my work to stand in for a community. I think there needs to be this sort of polyvocality. And while it might not exist in the form that we want it to in this current day and age, I feel like, you know, it will at some point, or I hope that it will at some point. I think, you know, the responsibility is being also vocal about the fact that it's like our perspective, that this is not what all Sikhs think, or this is not the perspective, because I think that has been troubling in the past in terms of Sikh arts, in Canadian art, and, you know, that being the end all be all. And really there are very few of us, right? Like a small enough amount that I can count it on my one or two hands. So it's a small community. We all kind of feel the same sort of pressures in a sense. I mean, I think my work is more so, mine and Connor's work is more so for like an audience that is willing to be critical and willing to be criticized, in the sense that like these are practices that we've all taken part in some way, shape or form, whether we've been there when someone's, you know, given a Rumala Sahib's Beta, or whether we've heard of it. It's something that's super common knowledge, and it's not something that we've ever been like, hey, you shouldn't do that, to our parents or our grandparents or our aunts or uncles, whoever. And I think in that sense, it's really difficult, because, you know, who am I to be telling our elders what we should and shouldn't do? But I'm still going to do it. I mean, I still feel like I have a perspective, and that's valid, whether or not that's going to be taken in the right way. Like, in terms of what I mentioned earlier about doing, you know, community consulting, I think that's important, but also to an extent. If someone's just shutting you down because they think critique is problematic, then maybe that person and their perspective doesn't actually matter to me.
Absolutely. And it's really good that, I mean, I guess your ontological expressions, like, while they are your own, it's wonderful to see that there is such a collective understanding of what you've put out, which is always great. I feel with Kirat, your piece, It was interesting because originally, like, you know, when you first come through the exhibition, you're really learning about the migration and the experience of that migration on self-identity, even in physical space, as Arjot created in her living room. Your piece, of course, was the outcome of that migration of those women. And then you created Those Women Now, a portrait of your mom. When you have conversations with your mom about her hope for the future generation, what are some of the things that she shares with you, if you feel comfortable sharing with us?
One thing that I've always appreciated about my mom, and I guess one of the reasons that I did want to honor her in that piece, was she has been one of my main teachers and one of my most important guides. And the whole idea, just to kind of give a little bit of a background about the painting, the whole idea of creating that piece was to create a monumental piece of work. And all kinds of people have been honored, I guess, through monumental painting in European traditions and Eastern traditions as well. But it's oftentimes a space and a scale that's given to people of certain aristocratic or, you know, certain royal standards and statuses. But the reason that I felt like it was important to put our mothers into that space is, they have been, I guess, kind of suppressed when it comes to history and speaking about legacy. I think that a lot of what they've passed down to us, either through lessons and history and teachings, and even just life skills, a lot of it is definitely valued, but it's rarely ever traced back and, you know, given that applaud. And I felt like for my mother's generation, you know, they did a lot for us that, you know, it's not just about the typical immigrant story of, you know, being thankful to your parents, but I think it's a lot more than that. It's about the craft that they passed down to us. Like, for example, in the piece, I wanted it to be a multimedia piece because I wanted it to speak to not only like the multi-layers of what they've passed down to us, but also, you know, literally speaking to the art of fabric work and embroidery. So in the piece, you see a very hyper realistic representation of the figure, which is my own mother. And that is usually, I mean, what I use as a technique to connect to the audience. So a hyper real aspect within that painting that pulls you in. And then the actual embroidery, which is kind of like this coat of arms, is the aspect of the surreal. But I mean, one of the most important lessons that she has given me, and what I appreciate about her, and I really hold that in high regard, is that she's always, you know, they're basic principles, but she's always told me that they almost sound kind of cliche, but I feel like coming from your immigrant Punjabi mother, it's kind of a big deal. But just the fact that you can achieve whatever you want to achieve if you focus and work hard enough at it. And you should do whatever you're happy doing, not just what people around you might deem to be appropriate. And that's kind of something that speaks to that strength of, you know, doing the work that you want to do, despite it not maybe being mainstream or accepted by others, but being true to yourself and honoring who you are. And that kind of reminds me a little bit about what Simran Preeth was saying earlier, that, you know, if these Gurdwaras reject you, well, you have a Gurdwara within. Pamela was also kind of saying that, you know, you are the Gurdwara. And I feel like that teaching that she's passed down to me has always been there. It's always helped me. I think it's, now that I think about it, like, I think it's really shaped who I am and what I do, because it's allowed me to, you know, despite the pressures around me, and despite, like, I guess speaking of it in a metaphor, despite like the different architectural spaces around me, I'm able to form my own little protective hut and, you know, do what I have to do, and just have those barricades of strength around me. And yeah, I think it's less of like an intellectual and academic lesson. I think it's more just like an overarching kind of spiritual, almost cliche sounding principle, but just that you do have whatever you need within you, and that is worthy of expression. It's worthy of following, and it's worthy of watering that seed.
I love that. I feel like all the artists that I called, I remember that was the terminology I kept using, because we're orchardists, and I'd be like, I just wanted to plant a seed and water it. If it makes sense to you, please let me know that you tasted the fruit of that. Sammy, you're in the Okanagan, and so you're very much at the cusp of, land that is impacted so much by climate change. There's so much Indigenous presence there, and there's so much change happening at a very rapid pace with UBCO and all of the tech startups and the boom that's going on there. How does it feel like being the way you are in such rapidly changing, shifting environments? What roots you in a space like Kelowna?
Yeah, it is changing a lot, and I think to what Preeth just said and what Pamela and Simran said earlier is that I think on this like spiritual journey of like reconnecting with oneself and trying to like let go of attachment to materialistic things or what society tells me what I should be chasing or what my life should be, like I think especially in this year of the pandemic and having to spend a lot of time with myself, like I think it's been a lot of focusing on that journey home and like really focusing on what makes me happy from an internal perspective. And then the environment I'm in is like, I'm in a natural environment. I'm always surrounded by nature, and that I find is really grounding. But I think in this world of change, like it sometimes is overwhelming for me of how much is changing, like how much our agricultural industry is changing, how much our energy industry is changing, how much our environment is changing. And it's just trying to like figure out what can I do on like just a small level to be able to contribute towards less waste, right? Or to contribute towards less, not contribute towards anything that's going to create any more negativity. So I think that's been more of my personal grounding. And especially since the farmers' protest, I think a big realization I had this last year was I've always known that I've lived on stolen land, but I think when I was protesting for farmers' rights, it really hit deep, is like, how can I fight for, not how can I, like, here I am fighting for my ancestral lands to stay with my ancestors while I live on stolen land. And I think this past year, that's been one of the things that I've really tried to focus on, is that whenever we speak about the land we live on or Indigenous communities, it's always in a very broad sense. And something that's always annoyed me is when people would say like Indians or South Asians, and I would always have to correct them and say I'm Punjabi and I'm Sikh, because I really wanted them to understand that my history is unique and is different, and I'm not part of some monolith. And it's the same thing with Indigenous communities. So part of my journey is whose land do I live on? It's not okay for me to just say I live on Indigenous land. It's like, which community's land do I live on? What's their history? What's their cultures? What's their traditions? Because it's going to be different than another community in another area. And I think on that journey of learning, like one of that for me big in the past year has been understanding where I live, what my connection to this land is, what my connection to the caretakers of the land I live on is, and what that means in a larger context. And it's just, and I'm sure like, a lot of people have been realizing this, is we were not taught this in school, and it's not enough anymore to say that our school system failed us. At some point, we have to take that responsibility to learn on our own. And I think like coming back to like that activism, I spent so much time learning about colonialism and residential schools because I studied political science. I learned that history, but I'm like, why didn't I invest the same time in learning cultural practices or, languages or cultural ways of being? Like I never invested in those because they weren't offered to me. But now I'm kind of like, we need to, as a collective, really make that effort. So that's been in the Okanagan. It's been brilliant. Like it's very different. I grew up in Alberta, so I mean, very different in the Okanagan. And it's been a good learning. And I find, especially with the community, the Punjabi community here, like being majority farmers, like that's also been really interesting. Is like, it's a kind of like that cultural shock sometimes, is when I go to a farm and I see somebody on a tractor, like I've only ever seen that when I went back to Punjab, and now I'm trying to resonate these two different lifestyles and understanding what does farming mean here. And yes, farmers back home are, it's not enough in this conversation to describe the challenges that they're facing in the government that they live in and the land that they, in that context. But farmers in Canada are also struggling, and farmers in the Okanagan are struggling. And what does that mean, right? And how do we translate that advocacy to our local communities? And so for me, this has been a year of learning. It's been a year of building community, and it's figuring out what role do I play and how do I contribute to the community that I live in.
Yeah, that's beautifully articulated. I have a question for Pamela and Simranpreet, or actually a question to all. When we speak of Sikh futurity, environment, climate change, this notion of sarvatapala and inclusivity, gender, class, caste, sexual orientation, and everything needs to be a part of that discussion and space making, whether physical or even just, in your own body. What can this imagined future, with that in mind, look like as we are living as settlers on these lands called Canada? This is something that I think about quite often. I wonder if anybody else can share their perspectives.
I mean, I think it looks like solidarity. I think that's really important. And I think while we've mentioned that a lot in this conversation, or not even a lot, we've just mentioned it in this conversation today. And I think, when I go to protests, or even for the CAB and NRC, when, the Indian government was stripping Muslims of their citizenship, it's like when Connor and I went to the protests, how many Sikhs did we see there? 2? And it's like now that we go to the farmers' protests, it's like every Punjabi Sikh is there. And obviously there's a lot of Punjabi masculinity, but it's like we need to show up for our Indigenous and Muslim and Black and every other minoritized group, brother and sister. And we just don't do that. And it's really sad to see. I feel like, yeah, sure. If I show up, that's one person showing up. And I feel like that's the smallest kind of, drop in the bucket. But I think it's really important to mobilize their communities and to have them understand, that we do live on stolen land and, what the colonial histories of this place are. I think one thing that I think about a lot, or have been thinking about a lot, is even when we talk or memorialize our histories in the last kind of century, and we talk about the Kamagana Maru, and we talk about, these hardships that these people faced and their clash with the colonial British government, but we don't talk about how, those 376 people from India were coming here, or, to Vancouver to settle and to be settlers. And I think that's a really big problem with our narrative, is that those are things that we just completely accept and that we don't question. And we really rally all of our Punjabi Sikh politicians to ask people like Justin Trudeau for an apology when there are bigger fish to fry, and there are other things where I'm not saying that that's not important and that those people aren't important. I mean, I've also made artwork about that, and I also feel like it is important, and that those struggles were real. But I feel like it is time for us to complicate our lives in this place, and how our community is in a lot of ways a model minority in a place where Indigenous people are still being dehumanized and still being marginalized. And I think that's the hard truth.
I totally agree. I think what Simranpreet said with solidarity is that, we do see our community does know how to mobilize. We are very organized, and we've seen it happen with the farmers' protest. But why don't we translate that? Why don't we show that in solidarity? And we're not building those bridges. And I think when I think of the future, I think what I was talking about earlier as well, it's, for me, it's a lot of shifting in the way we think and the way we engage. And whether that's in physical spaces in our communities or with others, but like this shift in our thought process and like actually trying to intentionally create inclusive spaces and intentionally trying to build solidarity, that having these conversations, raising, you know, the next generation to think like that and actually recognize that. Like my parents, you know, and I can't fault them because, you know, they had their own lived experiences and I've never gone through the trauma of immigration, and I can't speak to their experiences, but I know for them, like, you know, there is so much going on in their own lives that they didn't have that same time and space that I've had to like learn and, you know, deconstruct and just have the language and the privilege to even have critical thinking skills. Like sometimes, like, you know, my dad worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, like all he could think about was sleep, eat, work, right? Like, and here I am, like having had the privilege to go to university, I have the privilege to be in spaces like this. And I think this is where we, you know, when we have these dialogues and discussions, is how do we then make this more accessible for the rest of our community?
Especially, I don't know. I want to push back on that a little bit, because I feel like there are so many radical histories of Punjabi immigrants, of racialized immigrants, and the things that they've done and the challenges that they faced, but still being a voice for people. And I think there are a lot of people my age, a lot of millennials that, you know, go to work, they think their lives are so hard. They work for like whatever the tech company is, or whatever the developer is, or whatever, like, you know, the neo-colonial industry is, and they act like their lives are so difficult and that, you know, they're marginalized because they're racialized, which just isn't the fact. And I think, like, you know, by saying things like that, we also need to realize, like, you know, there were the Gurdwarites, and there were people that were really radical in our histories, and even if they were laborers, even if they weren't educated with the same sort of education that we have, they were there, and they were radical, and there were those histories.
I think and I recognize that those exist. I'm just speaking for my dad in particular. Like I don't mean to say that my dad's experience is that of any others, but I'm saying what I was raised with, and the example that was set for me and my dad's experience was not that. Did he have the opportunity to be radical? He probably did, but he just didn't. Like that wasn't his lived experience. And I think for me, like I can't expect him to have lived his life a different way. Like I don't think that's fair. Like I think I have to, as myself, recognize the life that I'm living, but also have that empathy and sympathy to know that, you know, he didn't live that life, or he didn't have that capacity, or whatever was going on in his life to be that way. And that's just him individually, not to say that that's reflective of any other person in our community in any way, shape, or form. But I think for myself, is like not being raised in that environment, but having that experience as myself, is what am I doing with my lived experiences now? And I think that's where I can take it forward, is that this is something that I know that I've been able to do, and how can I now create more spaces where that is more accessible and that is more normalized.
I'm going to just add to Simranpreet's commentary or perspective. And I you know, Kira talked about dominant views. And that's the thing, is that we live in a very, even though the world is more racialized than white, unfortunately, the folks who are the power and the privilege of most of these institutions that we work and live and play in happen to be, like, in terms of the people who hold the power, very much cisgendered, heteronormative folks, right? And there are two people that I'm going to bring up. Dr. Susan Dion is a Lenape and Potawatomi educational scholar from York University, and she talks about the analogy of the perfect stranger. The perfect stranger is, like, basically she has looked at educationalists, so particularly K-12 education, when it came to this country decolonizing and indigenizing. And obviously, prior to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report coming out and the calls for action, she talks about the analogy of the perfect stranger. And the perfect stranger is basically a positionality that a teacher will take. And, you know, they're basically like somewhat liberal or neoliberal in this case right now, And they generate a very hands-off relationship to indigeneity or indigenous people or students particularly. And they're like, their attitude is this, and I'm just going to mimic what happens in educational spaces when I go to professional development. I don't know if I have any indigenous students. I can't call them out. I don't think I have any indigenous colleagues. I don't have any like indigenous parents, right? So this is the kind of script that's often visited and revisited, that we're on land with a long history, a deep history of indigeneity on this land, but we don't know anything about them, right? And it's a very them, us. And guess what? We can't talk to it because this is a nation, a state, and a community problem. So we have we are racialized settlers, right? And guess what? We're not that far off. We had the same colonizers in India and in South Asia, most of South Asia. I know South Asia is a contested term, and many brown radicals will say, oh, I don't use South Asia. And then that turns into another half-hour conversation. But it's like,
go there.
What?
He said we won't go there.
We won't go there, right? Hey, I call myself a radical, but like, I can't, today's radicals are very different from my gen. I'm a Gen Xer through and through. But the thing is that non-Indigenous teachers lay no claim to being at all in proximity of indigeneity. And when I took this additional qualification to not just decolonize my pedagogy, but also teach an Indigenous visual culture class in grade 9 to 12 visual arts, I went through a very transformative, affective kind of experience where I was one of those perfect strangers that I thought, no, I don't have any Indigenous, like I'm naming myself there. But something that's interesting is that this isn't just an Indigenous and nation state problem. The thing is that we are all treaty partners. If we call ourselves Canadians, we're treaty partners. We have a responsibility and an accountability to learn on this land. And whether or not our parents and grandparents went to school or not, or they're and like we're all adults in this room, right now on the screen. Like we have the ability they taught us, they brought us up. We can now do the same, right? That's what aging is about, because your kids grow up to be adults and they start teaching the parents, right? And what I mean by that is that my mom often says, you're my teacher. Like, you're teaching me new things all the time. And I used to be like, Mom, I'm not your teacher. Like, you've already been taught. And she's like, no, there are things I don't know about Canadian society that you still teach me. Kira, I don't know, you're shaking your head. I guess you agree. And then the second thing I put up in the chat is Dr. Lynn Gale's, I put up two things. One, a link to the history of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the website, right? And now Dr. Lynn Gale, she has an amazing tool called the Ally Bill of Responsibilities. And that is basically for people like us. Before you start to think, okay, you know what, after this talk, I'm going to educate, and I'm going to activate, and I'm going to organize, right? Which is a very old strategy. But the thing is that we have to be informed, right? And this is what Indigenous folks are saying, like, don't just call yourself an ally. You have to be called in from the members of the community to be an ally, right? And I live mostly Anishinaabe land. So Dr. Lynn Gale is a Algonquin Anishinaabe Kwe. And I'm not going to read all of the responsibilities, but the first one is this: do not act out of guilt, but rather out of genuine interest in challenging the larger oppressive structures. The second one is understand that they're secondary to the Indigenous people that they are working with and that they seek to serve. They and their needs must take a back seat. That's me. That means me as a so-called responsible ally. It's not about centering myself, right? So we can't have these conversations about radically changing our ways of knowing and whatnot. And this is about your worldview. If you can't expand your worldview, then, give your seat up at the table so someone can come and work.
I think sometimes we're not fully realizing how complicit we are to hegemonic powers, because especially with neoliberal Judge Judaisms, like you don't even realize the impact of that until much later. And I think everybody here thankfully shares an openness to the first need to just, I think even before learning is unlearning, because you know, I don't think we fully realize how much we're implicated in this until we unlearn, because those biases are there, unfortunately. But one of the things that I would say, and I'm going to end it off with a question I want to ask all of you, but I work in arts, and most of the times that I've gone to my allies and close comrades about the state of affairs in Canadian society through the lens of culture, my Indigenous sisters are always the first ones to be like, okay, yes, truth and reconciliation is important, but there's criticism in that too. And to me, it's the decoupling of the two is something that I've been advocating for so much, because we don't even know all the truths yet. So what are we reconciling? So I feel like so many of my peers have, and I think all of us might be around these kinds of people that are like, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, call to action. Okay, we're doing that, we're doing that, we're doing that. And it's like, no, this is something that is alive. It is something that we are experiencing together, and we don't even fully know the extent of it yet. So what they've always shared with me, which I would love to share with you all, is that depending on which territory I'm on, and what work we're doing, it's always been like going into those meetings with just the openness of, this is the honest openness about like, this is our intention of this summit or this think tank or whatever it might be. And my hope is this, like, what does that collaboration look like? Does this align with your hope and intention? It's this like, it's coming down from like institutional frameworks and just having honest heart-to-heart conversations about how to be an ally or how to show up and support or what that is. And I love that if I'm in Charlottetown, the conversation always is quite different than when I'm in the Okanagan, as it's different when I'm in Banff or in Vancouver, because everybody is so distinct and where they're at in their self-learning is so different. So it's so hard for us to come to things with a corrective lens until we realize where we're at in that stratosphere. And that's been useful for me, because I feel like when I'm going into those spaces, most of the time I am operating under guilt, because I feel so much pain and lack of healing as a collective. So it's hard to go in there and even try to change, when I think the first thing we have to do is just acknowledge and possibly heal. I have a question because we're at 7:40, which is well over an hour. And this is something I asked all of the other panelists from the past and the present, and now we're speaking to the future. And I want to ask each of you, who is the most influential Sikh female presence in your life, past, living, you know, just who comes to mind for you? And whoever feels comfortable sharing their answer, go ahead.
I wanted to actually just say one quick thing. I know we're kind of running over time, but I really liked what you guys were speaking about in terms of keeping that open mind, because I don't think that our place in history is necessarily like a layered rock. It's more like a web. So even when it comes to like Summer Preeth, you were mentioning that it's important to critique situations in which we might be victimized, but I think it's also important to still keep the facts in mind. Like, for example, the people that came here on the Komagata Maru, although yes, they were settling here, they can't necessarily be likened to the British colonizers, of course, because the Sikh settlers that came here, they were, you know, treated a certain way in their own homelands. Their homeland was broken apart by the British, and then the British colonized a new land. And so it was almost as if the Sikh community was now hoping to benefit from the very people that kind of took from them. So I do feel like it's a very complex web rather than being, such a linear story. And I think it's so important to stay open and to realize that, we can learn from the generation before us, but the one coming after us as well. Like Pamela, you're mentioning how your mother said that you're constantly teaching her things. And I was nodding because I completely relate, especially when it comes to issues of queer people or trans people, non-binary people who weren't, who didn't have the opportunity to be so open about who they were during our parents' generation and before. So it's important for the generation before us to also have that openness, but especially us, because we're kind of in that position where we're setting a path for those ahead of us. And I was just going to say, for me, the most influential woman that I know is my mom. And I know that that sounds like a cliche again, but it's true. And it's true for a number of reasons. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. But I do feel very thankful that I did have a mom who taught me strength in a lot of different ways and who gave me support in almost every arena of my life, and believes in me more than I believe in myself, and just believes in, these greater principles of the universe to an extent that I don't even really understand how she keeps that faith. But I think that that's one thing that has given me a lot of strength. And it's just that idea of having unwavering faith that things will work out, put in the effort, follow the process, enjoy the process, and enjoy life. Like at the end of the day, it's really been those basic principles. And yeah, I'm just grateful that I can look to those in my mother.
What a surprise. I didn't think you would know. I want to say just on a tangent, there's these like moments that kind of crept to the top of my experience for chashm-e-bulbul in process and installation. And one of my favorite memories, I would say in the top 5, was meeting you and your parents, and the way they helped install your piece was, yeah, honestly, I'm like a diehard Capricorn and very rarely shed a tear. And I was sitting there, I was like, I hope he doesn't catch this. It was very, very special. And
that was so sweet. That was actually the first time that you and I had met, and it didn't feel like that at all. Actually, it was just like a very bonding moment. And even for my family, like I'm pretty sure they invited you to their home.
I know, I was like, I kind of wanted to go to their home a couple of times when I really miss my home, and just be like, Sasrikal,
no, they love you. They talk about you all the time. They ask about you, like anytime the exhibition comes up and everything. So yeah.
Very special indeed. Anybody else that has somebody that they would like to put forward?
That was so sweet, Kira, about your mom. So I guess, yeah, mom's always going to be my number one. And she's my tough life manager. I say that with a lot of humor, because anybody who knows, Punjabi Sikh moms, Tiger mom's second version after the
I would love for your mom to see the exhibition, and
she's planning on it. She's planning on coming.
If I can Uber her over to your to the exhibition,
this is
she's so far, let me know, because I would want
I
to.
will. Yeah, no, I'm trying to get her and my Masi to come. So yeah.
Okay, so
I just wanted, the question was about Sikh feminist. I guess Surinder Dhaliwal is her ongoing fangirl, but also as a young artist, looking up to her practice in Toronto was really, really beneficial for me. Just, I didn't have constant contact with her, but just her very existence. You see, I live with one.
It's right behind you.
Yeah, and she's gonna have a show upcoming at the AGO in a couple of, I don't know, a year or two. But she's always makes time to check in, and we just continue to have this lovely relationship, intergenerational as well. And she was very, very supportive of any projects that I've done in the past, but also she's always encouraging me to okay, Pamela, stop curating, focus on your work. And I'm like, okay, surrender. And you know, she's got like a similar trajectory, born in the UK. I was born in the UK. Her family's from Punjab. My family's from Punjab. It's not quite like, you know, mirrored in that way, but it's just like, even when I was reading her recent catalog, it's just, there's so many similarities around like upbringing and in a bicultural world. And just like, you know, also as a young artist, a female artist, like, you know, obviously when she was coming up in Canada, like, you know, it was very challenging. We're so fortunate to have this community and this table we're sitting around right now, whereas Surinder didn't have that kind of communal engagement, but she did have a larger, you know, she's definitely exhibited across Canada and internationally. So yeah, I'm very thankful and grateful for that relationship in my life.
Yeah, no, a very special one indeed. I mean, that piece behind you is stunning, and in person, you just
I
see
know, marigolds.
very special.
The moment I saw it, I just always, I have these visions of my mom always like buying marigolds in this, like, you know, for the summer, for the garden and stuff. And I would be so like, oh man, those ugly flowers. Why? And the moment I saw this work, I just started crying because I was like, oh my God, I have to buy this work. I have to buy this work. Yeah, because it was just like, it just hit me right here. And she was just like, okay, your mom likes marigolds? And I was like, yes, she adores them. And I didn't understand for the longest time until I saw this work. I was just like, wow, okay, mom misses home. Mom misses India, right?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for giving me the space. And this conversation was so...
Pamela, I will always give you the fucking space. I want you to make art all the time.
Thank you.
I've been putting, I think I've
Your
put together.
Pugatti work was so great in the show.
Oh, I don't even, this exhibition was so soul ripping apart and thinking and feeling, and it genuinely felt like it was like being channeled out of me, and I was just this like human body that was like, I don't know. I feel like I can't take credit for anything for this show specifically. Sorry, oh my God, that's Zainab Verji, who's awesome, but this is something that I shouldn't have had connected. Simran Preeth, I'm going to segue to you because I'm not, first of all, I don't know if you have an answer to the question yet, but I wanted to say, similar to Pamela, when I met you, it was through Jagdeep Raina, of course, and I feel like that sense of Sangat and sharing and holding of space for one another, you extended that for me throughout this exhibition install in such a way that I'll never forget. And that was, again, at the top as one of my favorite memories, despite the challenges of installing for an institution. Like you really, I don't know if I can articulate to you how much that meant to me in the times that we were hugging each other. And yeah.
That meant a lot to me as well. I feel like if you hadn't been there, it would have been a completely different experience. In the spirit of continuing to be, you know, polyvocal or thinking about, you know, multiplicities, I have 3 women that I want to acknowledge. The first is also my mother. I feel like we're a bunch of mother-loving people over here.
Girls.
And I want to, you know, say her name because I think that's also important. Her name is Sharon Gorgong, Anand. She recently finished a culinary program. She has taught me to be so resilient. She has been so resilient my entire life and has dealt with so much more bullshit than I have, that it's been just like an honor being in her presence and seeing that resilience, and hoping that I can, you know, embody that in whichever way I can. And then the second woman that I want to acknowledge is actually Connor's mom. Her name is Sharon Gorgong. She is amazing and incredible and fierce and says all of the things she thinks without really caring. And she also taught me how to sew, which, you know, really holds an important place in my heart and in my life. And then the third person that I want to acknowledge is Gavin Gorjima. And she is a best friend and like a sister and an incredible playwright and director. And yeah, I feel like I go to her for anything and everything and tell her everything about my life and vice versa. So I feel like those are the women who uplift me and hold me in my life and make sure I don't, become a wreck or all of that good stuff.
Yeah, I love that. And it's important to recognize what, like Brittany Cooper is one of my favorite Black feminists. And she talks about queer love, but not in the way that men talk about it. She talks about like the love we have for our friends that are female identifying. And for me, it's always been like, I would take a bullet for my girls, like 100%, like they're just being the most important, of course, our mom, but also our friends that have just been unconditionally supportive and, march along with you. Sometimes in front of you, sometimes behind you, sometimes right next to you, however you need them to be, which is so important. And Sami?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this as we were talking about it. And I think like all the women in my life, my mom, my sister, my grandma, even my friends, like I think I'm surrounded by such beautiful women. Like I'm very touchwood grateful for all the women in my life. But since we're talking about futurity, I can never say the word properly, but I think I'm going to use my childhood moment as I had a lot of aspiration to be like my Bago, because I just thought she was such a badass. And I think as a kid, having somebody like that, like a story like that, even though it's such a small, snippet of history that I was never told the full context ever, but just that little bit kind of gave me motivation as a young girl to feel like I kind of got strength through that, to be like, oh, I can, be resilient and I can be a warrior, I can be all these things. And obviously it was a more romanticized version as a child, but now when I think about how hard it is to be resilient as an adult, I think that that's something that was somebody that really inspired me and continues to inspire me. And I hope that, for future generations, whoever in their life inspires them, I just hope we continue to inspire that resiliency, because life is hard and it takes a lot to take it on. And the more we can feel like we have control and we can take things on, the better. So I think that one for me for sure.
100%. And I'll always be there to support all of your crazy ideas moving forward. In the Sikh past, I recognized Bibi Nanaki as my influence, because Guru Nanak is so peculiar. If you actually think about Guru Nanak Dev Ji, he wore, Bhakti garb mixed with Sufi mystic, turban, and, like, I love that Bibi Nanaki was the first person to say, you know what, go for it, man, and support him. For present, I said my sister Sunny and my mom Gurbaksh Gaur, because I didn't understand my mom Gurbaksh until Sunny had children. And I could fully understand what my mom was and did for us, because I could see my sister raising her twins, and I don't know how they do it. So for future, there's this saying, this woman called Jiri Yogo. She's a wonderful Toronto woman, magical being. She's from, I forget where in Africa, but she said that our grandmothers carry the future daughters as well, which means that when my mom was pregnant, she had Sunny, and because Sunny was, in her womb, Sunny was obviously having the eggs of Arjun and Anaya in her womb. So my mom, in effect, carried, these lineages. And so what I would say for future would be obviously my children that I don't know, not just mine. I mean, I look at every child as my own, but they inspire me more than perhaps any human and non-human being around me, because I feel at this point in my life, going through all the ups and downs and the fucking challenges that we all go through, what rooted me and saved my life was my love for the twins when they were born. There was an immediate realization when they were under that jaundice light that I am now literally on lease of a world that is theirs and not mine anymore. And I think Indigenous thought of the 7th generation principle rings so true, and it feels in my body now in ways that I never understood, which is, if we're not trying to make the world a better place, then what's the point? So I would say they're probably the ones that influence me the most at this point in my life. Thank you all for spending a full 2 hours with me. I kind of had a feeling this was going to happen, so thank you for sharing and holding that space. And you know, all the artists that got to exhibit, Preeth, Preeth, and Pamela, as I said to the artists that participated in the other panels, like, this couldn't have happened if I didn't have each of your support and your unique gifts of love and sharing. And the fact that you trusted me with your works just is very humbling, and something that I think is going to hit me after the exhibition strikes. But for now, I can just say thank you. And Sami, I just really appreciate your fire and your presence in this conversation. And thank you for participating.
Thanks for organizing this, Raji.
All of my pleasure and love to have had this opportunity. I wish you all the best evening and the best week ahead. And if you need anything, just count me in as your champion, now and forever. I think that when Sikh women come together, the world can truly change, because we care differently and we love in ways that I've never seen before. So thank you, and in solidarity.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, Simran.